Elias Wren checked into the first hotel under a false name, carrying nothing but a weathered suitcase and a purpose no one could see, and by the time he left, every hotel in the country would wish they'd never given him a key. He arrived in town like someone chasing shadows, carrying a single suitcase that looked older than the places he stayed in. No one remembered his name for long because it kept changing. Sometimes he was Mr. Grant, other times Mr. Lewis, and once, for reasons no one understood, he signed in as C. August. What people did remember was the feeling that followed him, a strange quiet, the kind that unsettled even the busiest lobbies. He never caused scenes or arguments, but something about him drew attention anyway, like a picture slightly crooked on a wall that you can't stop noticing. His first check-in was at a small, family-run hotel off the highway. He arrived close to midnight, polite and soft-spoken. The front desk clerk said he smiled like he already knew something you didn't. He requested a room on the top floor, facing away from the road, and asked for 2 extra pillows. That was all. The next morning, the housekeeping staff found the pillows untouched, but the bedside lamp had been moved to the center of the floor, switched on, and left humming softly. The curtains were drawn perfectly straight, the bed neatly made, and the only sign he'd been there was a note folded under the TV remote that read, "Too bright." The manager shrugged it off as harmless eccentricity and moved on. But small details began to build. In his next hotel, he left behind a mirror slightly turned toward the door, as if watching whoever entered. In another, the alarm clock was unplugged and placed inside the bathroom sink. Staff whispered about him without saying his name. Some said he was testing them, others thought he was running from something. Every time he left before checkout, slipping away unnoticed in the gray hours of early morning. The credit cards he used were always prepaid, and the phone numbers he gave led nowhere. For a while, it was nothing more than a string of strange housekeeping stories traded between hotels. Each place thought it was an isolated case, an odd guest passing through. But patterns have a way of drawing attention, even when no one means to look for them. By the time he reached his 7th hotel, staff were already alert. A night auditor recognized his description from a private Facebook group where front desk workers shared warnings. The post read, "If you see this man, double-check everything after he leaves. He's harmless but unsettling." What unsettled them wasn't what he did, but how ordinary it all seemed. No broken furniture, no missing items, just a series of small rearrangements that made rooms feel wrong. It was as if he wanted people to notice but not understand. One hotel manager, reviewing security footage, saw him stand in the hallway outside his room for several minutes, staring at the carpet, no movement, no sound, just stillness. When he finally stepped back inside, he turned the "Do Not Disturb" sign upside down. No one could explain what that meant. By the time the first formal complaint was written, he had already disappeared into another city, another alias, another Rome. The incident reports described him in fragments: quiet, polite, strange, and ended with the same phrase each time: banned from returning, but he never stopped checking in somewhere else. The stories about him began to move faster than he did. Hotel workers who had never met each other started recognizing the same odd guest through word of mouth. He had become a quiet legend in the hospitality world, the kind of rumor that spreads in break rooms and late-night shifts. What made it strange was how mild everything seemed. No thefts, no violence, no destruction, just small, eerie traces left behind like breadcrumbs that didn't lead anywhere. Yet, every trace felt deliberate, as if he was performing some private experiment inside every room he entered. Managers began documenting his visits, each one noting the same pattern. He booked for one night, arrived late, and left early. He asked minimal questions but paid sharp attention to every detail of the front desk. Some staff said he watched the check-in process too closely, noting names and badge numbers as if collecting data. Others said he would always pause by the security camera above the counter just long enough to make people uncomfortable. In most cases, the footage showed nothing illegal, but something about his precision felt unnatural. A regional hotel chain eventually connected the dots. Their internal system flagged multiple bookings under different names but with similar handwriting. The addresses listed on the forms were fake, but one detail slipped through: the same phone number used across for different cities. When the number was traced, it led to a prepaid phone registered under a company that didn't exist. This was the first real clue that he wasn't just an odd traveler. He was careful, but not perfect. Employees started saving copies of his sign-in cards and sharing them through quiet back channels. A pattern of initials appeared. Each alias used a first name that started with the same letter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give investigators something to hold on to. The idea that he was just a harmless eccentric began to fade. He was building a pattern of presence, and the hotels were the canvas. By the end of that summer, more than a dozen hotels had formally banned him. Still, he found new ones. There was always another small town inn, another roadside motel that didn't check records closely. He slipped through booking systems like a ghost, adjusting his story with every new check-in. To most guests, he was invisible. To staff, he had become a quiet nightmare that arrived with polite smiles and left behind confusion. It wasn't until a maintenance worker in one hotel reviewed footage from a faulty hallway camera that a new piece of the puzzle appeared. The man was seen kneeling near a ventilation grate, not tampering with it, but photographing it. A few seconds later, he adjusted the room thermostat, took another picture, and left. The images were never found, but the behavior was consistent in every later report: brief inspections, subtle rearrangements, and photos of things no one else cared about. Hotels began to treat him as a professional nuisance, someone intentionally testing their systems. A few whispered that he was a corporate spy, mapping vulnerabilities for a competitor. Others said he was just obsessed with patterns, trapped in his own logic. Either way, the trail of minor disturbances had grown into a paper wall of warnings. Each new city knew about him before he arrived. Every front desk clerk carried his description taped under their counter. He had become both everywhere and nowhere, banned from dozens of hotels but never caught, still checking in under another name, always with that same quiet smile that left everyone uneasy long after he'd gone. When the security footage finally came together, it changed everything. For months, each hotel had only seen a piece of the puzzle: a few minutes of grainy video, a strange guest moving too slowly through hallways, a shadow slipping out before dawn. But when those fragments were compiled and reviewed by a regional investigator, the full pattern emerged. What they saw wasn't random behavior. It was deliberate, measured, and deeply unsettling. The man moved through every hotel as though following invisible instructions, like he was auditing the buildings themselves. He never stayed still for long, yet he didn't rush either. In one clip, he stood in front of a fire alarm for exactly 1 minute, holding his phone up to the small inspection sticker before moving on. In another, he knelt beside an exit door and seemed to count under his breath, tapping the handle 3 times before walking away. He didn't steal, didn't damage property, didn't even speak to anyone if he could avoid it. But there was intent in his movements, a quiet rhythm that suggested purpose. What confused investigators most was that he left nothing of value behind, only subtle signs that he had paid attention to the smallest, most overlooked details. In one hotel, he unscrewed the cap on a complimentary pen and placed it upside down on the desk. In another, he arranged 3 sugar packets into a triangle on the nightstand. To anyone else, it looked like nonsense, but to the people now analyzing every frame, it felt like a code. When technicians enhanced the footage, a pattern became clearer. He always lingered near emergency exits, thermostats, or maintenance hatches. He often photographed small metal plates and serial stickers, the kind that only engineers or inspectors ever noticed. A technician who once worked for a hotel construction firm recognized one of the numbers. It belonged to a manufacturer that supplied safety hardware to hundreds of hotels nationwide. That discovery reframed everything. Maybe he wasn't simply eccentric. Maybe he was tracking something the hotels didn't even know was wrong. The question then became, was he exposing flaws or exploiting them? His background was still unknown. None of the names he'd used were real, and his fingerprints didn't match any criminal database. Yet his pattern suggested expertise, not madness. He knew where cameras couldn't see, which hallways stayed unguarded after midnight, and which back doors were left unlocked for deliveries. Every step was intentional, every visit precise. When one security officer zoomed in on a frame from a lobby camera, she noticed something chilling. On his phone screen, reflected in the glass of a framed photo, was a spreadsheet filled with numbers and dates. The titles were blurred, but one phrase stood out. Failure points. The officer didn't understand it, but the phrase lingered. Was he building a map of weak spots, a private inventory of danger? As the footage spread through corporate offices, panic began to grow. Hotels started tightening their security protocols, replacing locks, installing new cameras, and cross-referencing maintenance logs. Yet the man seemed to stay one step ahead. Wherever he went, he found new angles, new blind spots. He was not breaking laws in any obvious way, but his very presence was now treated like a threat. The last known video of him showed something different. Instead of documenting, he paused in the middle of a hallway and stared directly into a camera, expression unreadable. Then he smiled just slightly and turned away, leaving the frame. Moments later, the feed glitched for a few seconds before returning to normal. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. By the time anyone reviewed that clip, he was already gone, leaving behind another perfectly arranged room, another invisible question no one could answer. News of the mysterious guest spread beyond hotel management and private security groups, slipping into the public eye through rumor and online speculation. A freelance journalist covering corporate safety claims stumbled upon the story after a leaked internal memo mentioned an unidentified man conducting unsanctioned inspections. That phrase was enough to spark curiosity. Soon, forums and blogs were filled with grainy screenshots from security footage, blurry photos, and wild theories. Some called him a whistleblower trying to expose hidden dangers in the hospitality industry. Others believed he was a saboteur planting something unseen in each hotel. Whatever he was, his legend had outgrown his actions. Corporate offices scrambled to get ahead of the story. Official statements described the man as a persistent security concern and warned staff to deny service if he appeared. The warnings only made him more famous. People online began calling him the inspector. Hashtags turned his behavior into a kind of urban myth, part truth, part fiction. Videos broke down his movements like a puzzle, each gesture analyzed for meaning. Even his silence was dissected, framed as evidence of genius or madness. For hotels, the attention was a nightmare. For the public, it was entertainment. Behind the scenes, investigators kept uncovering fragments of his past. An anonymous source within a safety certification company leaked documents suggesting that a former engineer had been dismissed after reporting unapproved hardware substitutions in several hotels years earlier. The man's name was redacted, but the timing and description matched too closely to ignore. If it was the same person, then he had once been responsible for inspecting exactly the kinds of fixtures he now seemed obsessed with. That revelation shifted the tone of the investigation. Suddenly, he wasn't a stranger anymore, he was someone who might know the industry's secrets better than anyone else. As journalists dug deeper, they found evidence that some of the hardware photographed in his footage was indeed faulty. Certain models of emergency door brackets had been recalled quietly, but many hotels never replaced them. Others had purchased counterfeit parts through third-party suppliers to cut costs. What had seemed like random behavior now looked like a mission. The man wasn't just documenting rooms, he was gathering proof. But if he was trying to expose corruption, he had chosen the strangest possible way to do it, through cryptic patterns and silence instead of open accusation. When the story reached major news networks, the public reaction split in two. Some praised him as a reluctant hero uncovering corporate negligence. Others saw him as a paranoid intruder violating privacy under the excuse of investigation. Lawsuits began circulating between hotel chains, vendors, and insurers, each blaming the other for the mess. The man himself remained missing, unseen since the last recorded video where he had looked directly into the camera and smiled. What unsettled investigators most was the discovery of encrypted files found on a hotel server shortly after his disappearance. They contained lists of serial numbers, dates, and what appeared to be inspection notes written in shorthand. No one knew how the files had been uploaded, but their accuracy was undeniable. When tested, several of the listed fixtures failed safety standards. For the hotels, it was proof of negligence. For everyone else, it was proof that the stranger had been right all along. The corporations issued new safety recalls and quietly settled several legal disputes, avoiding public acknowledgement of the man's findings. In the official reports, he was labeled a non-compliant contractor acting outside his duties. But among hotel staff and those who had followed his trail, another truth lingered: he had uncovered something real, even if no one wanted to admit it. And while the public story ended with his disappearance, the hotels kept his name on their ban lists, afraid he might return one night, check in again, and start the whole thing over. Months passed after the headlines faded, but the story of the man people called the inspector refused to disappear completely. Hotel employees whispered about him during night shifts, telling newer staff to double-check rooms on the top floors and keep an eye out for guests who asked a few questions. Some swore they'd seen him again passing through a lobby in another city, reflected in a mirror, always walking just out of focus. There were never any confirmed sightings, but his reputation had already taken on a life of its own. He was more myth than man now, a reminder of how easily an ordinary place could turn strange. Then a discovery changed everything again. A maintenance supervisor at a shuttered hotel chain storage facility found an unmarked box during inventory. Inside were flash drives, old inspection forms, and a folded map. The forms were written in the same blocky handwriting found on his old check-in cards. The drives contained hundreds of photos, close-ups of exit latches, air vents, fuse panels, and thermostats, all labeled by date and hotel name. One folder stood out, marked simply as proof. It held audio recordings of phone calls he had made to corporate offices, warning them about faulty parts and potential hazards long before his hotel visits became suspicious. The companies had either ignored him or threatened legal action if he spoke publicly. It became clear that he hadn't started out as a saboteur. He had tried to follow the rules. When no one listened, he began showing up in person, forcing the issue by leaving undeniable traces behind. He had become his own kind of alarm system, moving silently through buildings that wouldn't admit they were broken. The strange rearrangements, the photographs, even the cryptic notes all served one purpose: to make people pay attention. His silence had never been the absence of words. It was the only language left to him when no one wanted to hear the truth. Investigators quietly reopened the case. They discovered that several hotels on his route had undergone sudden renovations shortly after his stays. Safety audits confirmed that some of the issues he had documented were real. Locks that jammed during emergencies, vents with outdated wiring, sprinklers that never worked properly, all replaced, all now compliant. None of the hotels admitted that his actions had forced their hand, but the timing said enough. The man who had been banned everywhere had somehow improved the very places that had thrown him out. Still, there were questions that couldn't be answered. The recordings ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if he had stopped talking to take a breath and never returned. The map in the box showed a route that stretched farther than anyone expected across borders, toward hotels that had yet to report any incidents. Some believed he was still traveling, still inspecting, using new names and different methods. Others thought he had disappeared intentionally, his mission finished once the truth had finally surfaced. Years later, a photograph began circulating online. It showed an abandoned seaside hotel at sunrise, its windows reflecting soft light. On one of those windows, faint but visible, someone had written a single word in the dust, checked. No one could prove who had done it, but everyone who knew the story felt the same chill. Whether he had vanished, retired, or started again somewhere new didn't matter anymore. The man who had been banned from every hotel had left behind a question that no one could erase: how far someone must go to make the world notice what it refuses to see.